In this module with Aurelia, we will look at building views in more detail, specifically the different bindings that Aurelia supports, as well as some different techniques for building custom elements. Along the way, we'll also see how to build a form for editing a movie, but let's get started by reviewing some of the markup we've already written. So far in this course, we've seen that we use templates to implement the view for a view model, and templates always start with a template element. The template element was defined by the HTML5 specification as a way to declare document fragments for script manipulation. And this is exactly what Aurelia will do. Aurelia will manage these templates, place them into the DOM at the appropriate place, and then allow us to use data binding and string interpolation expressions inside. The purpose of data binding is to link the state and behavior in our JavaScript view models with this HTML that is in the template. We do this using constructs like repeat.for, href.bind, show.bind, and we've seen others in this course like click.delegate. There is also if.bind. Show.bind will simply show and hide an element depending on the truthiness of the expression inside. So the element is invisible when this value is false, while the if attribute, this will actually remove this element from the DOM entirely if the value is false, not simply hide it, but remove it. And then if will add this element back to the DOM when the value is true. But the common piece that you'll notice in all these binding expressions is the dot, the period. We say href.bind or if.bind or repeat.for. And basically the Aurelia templating and binding mechanisms, they jump in to parse these expressions. You can dot bind to just about any attribute, standard attributes as well as custom attributes. For example, on this list item, I could bind to the style if I want to set inline styles, or I could bind to the text content property of the list item. But sometimes all I want to do is mix in my own string content with the markup and static content on this page. And that's when I can use string interpolation with the $sign and the curly braces. I can use interpolation to produce content that the user can see, like when I use row.title to build the text for a menu entry. And I can also use interpolation to set attribute values like I'm doing with the class of this list item, to highlight the active menu item. And there's really two ways I could have done this. I could have done this using interpolation. I could have also done this with a bind. And with bind, I wouldn't need the curly braces or the $sign. So when would you choose to use interpolation versus bind? Well, for this scenario, I probably would use the bind syntax because it's a little bit cleaner. But interpolation would help if I wanted to mix some static content into the class name. For example, what if I wanted a second class name here? Maybe because I wanted to turn this link into a button. When I'm not using bind, I can just type that into the class attribute, and it will always be there. The active class might be there too, depending on how this expression is evaluated. If I wanted to do this with the bind syntax, I would have to bind to an expression that could produce a string with both button and active when the element is active, and only button when the element should be inactive. Another significant difference between string interpolation and .bind is that string interpolation is always one way. We always move content from the view model into the view as a string, whereas .bind can be one or two-way binding. Aurelia always picks a sensible default. So if I bind to a class attribute, that's going to be a one-way binding. But if I bind to the value of an input element, that will be two-way binding by default, because Aurelia will assume if the user types into the input that I want that value pushed back into the JavaScript object. There is syntax available to explicitly request one-way or two-way binding, but let's look at a place where we can use two-way data binding. Let's build out an edit page for a movie.